169 million migrant workers in the world. And that means that 1 in every 20 workers is a migrant worker. 70 million of those workers are women, and they're found in all sectors and all locations. And there's very little that we eat, use, wear that hasn't had the role of a migrant worker somewhere involved in its production or delivery. We also rely, of course, on many migrant workers for the delivery of many of the services that we enjoy around the world. So migrant workers are a very important constituent of the global economy, and perhaps don't get given enough credit for that. What we see, however, is very often that migrant workers face challenges at all stages of typical migration cycles. They very frequently are subject to various forms of sort of exploitative practices. They're very often low waged. Very often their living and working conditions aren't at as good as we might expect. And this throws up many challenges for those workers, but also for the businesses who are recruiting and employing them, because decent businesses want to make sure that their workforces are treated fairly and with respect. However, sometimes it's very difficult for companies with very extended supply chains across global locations to be adequately informed or to undertake the necessary due diligence to make sure that everything is the way it should be. And so migrant workers are in every supply chain, and of course it's vital that companies pay as much attention to these migrant workers and to the ways that their rights can be better protected and realised right the way through the piece. Migrant workers, like many low-waged workers around the world, often already face very few viable economic options at home. That's why migrant workers become migrants very often, because they don't have viable options to take where they are. And they tend to be impacted by the effects of climate change more than other workers around the world. Many of them are employed in situations, agriculture, forestry, things like this, that will be dramatically impacted by climate crisis. It's very easy to only think of the environmental shocks that these workers will suffer, things like a flooding of land, inundation, salination of land, desertification, the opposite. This will see increased numbers of workers on the move, seeking better livelihoods, better futures. Sometimes those things might be temporary. There's quite a lot of evidence that workers do want to return to their land, and they're trying to use migration as a way of getting over immediate hardships. But as we see climate crisis roll out and nobody knows what the futures will be, it might be that certain places in the world become uninhabitable and certainly unfarmable. And therefore, we will see maybe an end to some of the traditional ways of living, traditional agriculture, and traditional industries in many of these places. I think that we shouldn't only think about environmental shocks, however. There are also going to be economic shocks as part of the just transition, as part of the adaptations that we're going to have to make towards to adjust towards climate crisis. We are going to increasingly see old carbon-heavy industries closing down. These would be industries like mining would be a very good example, coal mining in particular. These industries very often in many parts of the world employ large numbers of low-waged workers. Very often things like mines support large communities around them. And so as we see the necessity to for those industries to come to an end. We will also see large numbers of workers no longer with viable economic options where they are. Increasingly, we are seeing older populations in the global north and low birth rates, and we're seeing young, more restless populations in the global south and increasing birth rates. And in the global north, this will lead to a lack of workforce, and that will have two impacts. One, there'll be new sectors effectively created in caring jobs, social care for elderly populations and health jobs in the health sector. And so this new sector will be created that they are already in very many countries absolutely desperate for workers. There are acute shortages of workers already in these sectors. And so increasingly workers from the global south will be deployed and employed in those sectors. Maintaining adequate workforces, as well as keeping existing industries and new industries going, is also important, of course, to maintain the tax base, because if workers aren't there earning money, it will impact dramatically on the tax base just when countries need increased taxes to pay for their increasingly aging populations. So you've got a sort of double whammy there. So I think that that's the other really compelling factor that we'll see an increase in migration, south to north migration in particular, across all of the countries. For migrant workers, we're at a very low starting base, unfortunately. I mentioned previously that there are very large numbers of migrant workers around the world. However, they are discriminated against very, very frequently, sometimes in the way that they're employed, in the sectors that they are allowed to be working in. Very often they're not on the same rates of pay and conditions as other workers. They have trouble accessing grievance mechanisms. Very often it's very difficult for the trade unions to represent them. All of the usual safeguards that normal workers might enjoy very often aren't there. And for migrant workers, I think there's a big responsibility on companies to undertake additional due diligence to make sure that their processes and the ways that they're managing some of those challenges that migrant workers might be facing are in place, that they've got efficient, effective processes to make sure that migrant workers don't suffer discrimination, that they are treated fairly, and that the way that those workers are being recruited and employed adheres to international sort of standards. I think as well that there is a particular issue around migrant workers as well, with common attitudes towards migrant workers, that migrant workers very frequently get seen as other. It's very much a political hot potato in many countries that migrant workers will come in and do jobs. There's very often an idea that these workers are taking jobs, but as we've just discussed, the jobs need to be done, and there's nobody to undertake this work very often. But attitudes towards migrant workers is a really serious issue. It leads to these workers being discriminated against, and it can lead to issues around social cohesion. We mentioned previously about migrant workers coming to new places, and very often that will be towns. And it becomes difficult for towns and cities to accommodate perhaps migrant workers in the way that they might do. And this, is another way that social conflict and lack of social cohesion may sort of show itself. And you know, as new jobs develop, as the um, climate crisis will throw up new jobs, there will be arguments about who these jobs are intended for. Are they intended for the settled native populations, or should migrant workers be allowed to come and take those jobs? Whose jobs are these new green jobs? And I think there's an important role for business there. Business is very good actually at getting different workers to work together. We've seen very impressive results with companies doing good work around things like diversity, around racism, around LGBT. And I think that there's a role for companies as well in making sure that migrant workforces are not excluded and are kept as part of normal workforces at any company. And there's a very interesting and useful role that companies can play in that space.